pod bay doors.
Greetings and welcome to another exciting episode of the Cinematic Traveler Podcast. I am your intrepid movie exploring host, Chris, and on this episode, we return to the 23rd century to continue our series of reviews for the first 6 films in the Star Trek film franchise. This time, we take a look at Star Trek II, The Wrath of Kahn, directed by Nicholas Meyer. And I am so excited to talk about this because this is actually one of my favorite movies of all time. So I'm going to have a lot of fan geek boy moments throughout this review. I will try to restrain myself, but I make no guarantees. So before we get into everything, let me just ask a favor of you. Whatever you're listening to this show on, somewhere on that screen, there is a follow button. If you could please click that follow button, it would help me out. It also helps you out because you won't miss another episode of this amazing podcast to hear my incredible reviews and my sexy, sexy voice. See how I deepened my voice there, put a little bass in there? That's pretty clever. Also, you can follow me on my social media. I would recommend Instagram at Cinematic Traveler Pod. I also have a Twitter account at CMT Pod, and a Blue Sky, whatever the hell that is, at Cinematic Traveler Pod, something. And I have an email address, if that's the easiest way for you to get in touch with me, and that is thecinematictravelerpod@gmail.com. So you have plenty of ways to get in touch with me and follow the show. You can also leave ratings and reviews. I would appreciate all of that. Share it with your friends and family on social media. Anything you can do to help, I appreciate it. Other podcasters, they say they do, but they don't. I truly do appreciate it. That's why I put out so much content for you, because I love you so much. So now that I have sufficiently buttered you up, let's go ahead and get into this episode. Of course, you know, from listening to my Star Trek The Motion Picture review, you have to meet me in the transporter room so that we can transport into my review for Star Trek II, The Wrath of Kahn. Scotty, energize. All right, so with Star Trek II, once again, directed by Nicholas Meyer, who this was only his second feature as a director. He was a pretty prolific writer, both of screenplays and novels. A big Sherlock Holmes fan. He did the 7% Solution and a couple of Sherlock Holmes novels, but he also did a really cool movie before this called Time After Time with Malcolm McDowell, who plays H.G. Wells, and he has to battle with David Warner, who is Jack the Ripper. Excellent movie. I know we're not talking about that, but if you get a chance, go check that out, Time After Time. But at any rate, this is his second movie and probably the most vital movie in the franchise, because if it had failed, then we would not be here talking about Star Trek movies. Now, before I get into everything, I am going to give you a plot review for the film. A couple of things I want to touch on for my regular listeners. I am not going to be doing the movie quote contest, so you don't have to worry about that. Also, I have decided after the first review for Star Trek The Motion Picture, I am not going to give you the actor names for the original cast. I think by now we all know who they are. I might use their names in the review part, but for my synopsis, I'm not going to, just to save us a little bit of time. And one other thing I was going to say, just to remind you, this isn't really a retrospective of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Kahn. I am going to touch on a few pieces of trivia that I found interesting, but I don't want to do like this deep dive into everything on this movie, because then it would take, for this movie, because I love it so much, it would probably take days for me to finish that. Okay, so I have over-explained everything sufficiently, and I think you will agree with Captain Kirk when he says,
"Do you mind telling me what this is all about, mister?"
So, as I mentioned, once again, we travel to the 23rd century and join the bridge of the USS Enterprise. We meet familiar faces, Spock, McCoy, Uhura, and Sulu, but instead of a familiar captain in the captain's chair, they are being led by Lieutenant Savick, played by a young Kirstie Alley, and she has led the Enterprise into a no-win situation. Now, Saavik is seemingly responsible for the death of most of the bridge crew, as well as the destruction of the Enterprise herself. But then it is revealed that this is actually a simulation for some training that is being overseen by Admiral Kirk. Now, this training exercise leads to Admiral Kirk boarding the Enterprise to supervise a training mission full of new cadets to Starfleet. Now, unbeknownst to our intrepid space cowboys, an old adversary of Kirk's, Kahn, played by Ricardo Montalban, has been found by Chekhov and Captain Terrell, played by Paul Winfield, who are in the USS Reliant that is on a research mission for a planet that is devoid of life, so that a new device can be tested on this planet. It is called the Genesis device. And this device is capable of creating life on these barren worlds. But it also has a little bit of a side effect, because if there is life on the planet, it actually destroys that life, creating the new life. Now, Khan, once he captures the USS Reliant and Chekhov and Captain Terrell, he sees the destructive possibilities of the Genesis device and decides to steal it from Dr. Carol Marcus, played by B.B. Besh. Now, Dr. Marcus, she is an old flame of Kirk's and also the mother of the son Kirk never got to know, and his name is David, played by Merritt Buttrick. Now, despite Khan's best efforts, Dr. Marcus is able to evade his attempt to steal the Genesis device, at least at first, and part of that is because Khan, he's pressed for time, since he has to seek out Admiral Kirk and get his revenge for the fact that Kirk left him on SETI Alpha 5 way back when he first appeared in Star Trek in the Space Seed. So he goes after Kirk, and the Enterprise gets the upper hand and actually damages our sweet, sweet Enterprise and her crew. But Kirk, he doesn't like to lose and has a few tricks up his sleeve, which leads to a final space battle confrontation between the damaged USS Enterprise and the USS Reliant that leads to deadly consequences for both sides. Now, does Kirk defeat Khan? Okay, all right. I know I did this last time, and I'm not going to do it again. But you know. I mean, come on. We got 6 films with this crew. You know how the story's going to end. But it's an exciting ending, and a very emotional one at that. So I won't try to trick you with any clever questions. We'll go ahead and move into our review for Star Trek II, The Wrath of Kahn. For those of you who are new to the podcast, or if you haven't listened in a while, just to remind you, I do break my reviews down into 3 segments: the good, the bad, and the nitpicky. The good is the stuff that I like in the movie. The bad, obviously, stuff that doesn't. And the nitpicky, these are things that are neither good nor bad. Just things they put in these movies, sometimes Hollywoodisms, just sometimes little silly things that stick out to my silly brain. And they make me laugh, and I'm going to try my best to make you laugh, because if there are 2 things on this planet I'd like to do, one of them is to make you laugh, and the other is to boldly go. Well, I don't get to boldly go much anymore, but at any rate, hopefully I can make you laugh. So let's go ahead and talk about the good. First off, one of the most prime examples of positives in this movie, and something that they learned from Star Trek the Motion Picture, is they streamlined the hell out of this movie. Actually, this is a very tight movie. It moves at a breakneck pace. There's hardly any fat on the bone. I dare say it's almost a perfect movie in that it accomplishes what it wants to do, and it does not waste your time doing that. Whereas, if you remember from my Star Trek the Motion Picture review, that movie tended to ramble on and have extended long scenes, especially with the Enterprise porn and the V'ger cloud that seemed to drag the movie out longer and longer. This one does not. We still have some Enterprise porn, but they definitely cut it down. In fact, they reused some of the shots from the first movie. They had a much less substantial budget for this film. I think it was around $15 million as opposed to the 60-some million of the first film. That's why it was so important for this film to basically succeed, because the studio was not happy. Although the first film did make a profit, they wanted it to bring in like Star Wars type numbers. So they were worried that if this film failed, that would pretty much be the end of the franchise. I will say they did bring in a new producer, Harve Bennett. And on a little bit of trivia that I absolutely love is that he was known for being that type of producer who can find ways to cut costs and streamline things and get stuff done in a timely manner. But when he was hired, he had no idea about Star Trek. Like, he knew of it, but he had never watched any of the shows. And he decided to sit down and watch every episode of the original series for two reasons. One, to find a villain, because they decided that this movie needed an actual villain instead of V'ger like in the first movie. And also so that he would understand what the show was about, the chemistry, the camaraderie, and the adventures that they all shared and what was important, and interject that into this movie so it felt more like the Star Trek that we know and love. And I think he was very successful at that. So with all of that, and Nicholas Meyer added into it, yeah, this movie does not waste your time at all. It moves, as I mentioned, at a breakneck pace. You start off very early, getting reacquainted with everybody and learning about the training mission, and boom, then you got Khan coming after Kirk. You got one space battle in which Kirk barely escapes, and then that all leads to the final one. And what I liked also about the space battles in this movie, this isn't sort of like Star Wars or what they do now, where it's just nonstop action and these ships are zooming around. This is much more of a naval battle. That's what Nicholas Meyer brought to the movie. He wanted this to be sort of Horatio Hornblower in space and have these epic naval battles. So every shot that the ships take, it has a consequence. You feel it for the crew and the ship, especially the Enterprise, because we love her so much. But everything, like I said, it's not a dizzying display of special effects, but it has more of an impact in the way that it's shot and edited, so that, that you understand the consequences of everything that happens in these battles, so that by the end, when they reach the Mutari Nebula, you're really on the edge of your seat, because it could only take one shot, and that could be the end of our intrepid crew aboard the Enterprise. And while they did streamline things, I think the movie still looks really good. I will say the motion picture is a more beautiful film on a sci-fi level with all, like I said, I go back and listen to the other one, the V'ger Cloud. I think it looks amazing, but this still looks good. They got great model work for both ships. They've sort of given everything a militaristic approach in this film, so the uniform's been updated mercifully, and now it's much more of a, I would say, yeah, like the Navy. They've got like a tunic that they wear and a lot more regimented, and you kind of understand who people are when they're wearing the uniforms. Plus the way they board the ship, they got that little whistle that you've heard in all of the Navy movies, and the way commands are given and inspections, it feels like you're watching a Navy movie set in space. I also like they've got the torpedo room where everybody's loading the proton torpedoes, and Nicholas Meyer did say, yes, he understands that the 23rd century, that would be an automatic process, but he just thought it looked cool, so he put it in the movie, and I can't help but agree. It does help, again, heighten the tension, kind of building up to the battle. You're ready to see what the Enterprise can do to this ship led by Khan that's already kicked its ass once. But yeah, I do like that they sort of took that approach with the look of the film, because it feels a little more authentic to what they're doing on screen. There's still stuff with like the Mutari Nebula that looks gorgeous. It's got sort of this kind of similar to the V'ger Cloud. It's got the lightning and stuff, and it's got the weird colors, and the ships kind of hide in it and sneak up on each other, and they have that sort of cat and mouse thing. It reminded me of Balance of Terror, if anybody remembers that episode of the original series. That's actually my favorite episode of the original series, but it had that feel to it. Let's see, what other cool looking things do they have? Beautiful matte paintings of the Genesis tunnel. And then a little trivia here. The sequence that Spock and Kirk and McCoy watch of the Genesis device and what it does, it's a simulation, and they show it on the screen of it basically changing a planet that has no life into a planet that is full of life and has an atmosphere and everything. Well, that sequence, the special effects were done by Industrial Light and Magic, and they were done by a division of ILM that did computer-generated imaging. And this is the first full CGI sequence put in the film. And just on a side note, the division that created that, eventually George Lucas sold it off, and it became Pixar. So there's a little bit of interesting trivia, and also to let all of you diehard Star Trek fans know that without Star Wars, Star Trek movies would have failed. I just had to do that. I had to do that. But I think the look of the film is perfect for what it's trying to accomplish, and it does pull you into that 23rd century. Although there are a few examples I'm going to talk about too later. Anyway, moving into the next positive, and this one's an easy one. The performances, especially William Shatner. I think this might be his best Kirk performance. I said it in the previous one. I think all 6 films, I think he does a great job in varying degrees as Kirk. We all know Shatner and Kirk's kind of one and the same, but here he's dealing with the fact that he's not a young man anymore. He's middle-aged. It starts right around his birthday. They have this scene where McCoy comes over to celebrate, and Kirk is depressed, and McCoy, he calls him out. He's like, "Damn it, Jim. We all have birthdays. Why do we treat yours like a funeral?" And really, it's because Kirk has taken that position of an admiral. He misses being in the Enterprise and going on those adventures, but he understands that that's a young person's game. And he's struggling to come to terms with that and come to terms with his place in this universe or even in his life, because, I mean, he had been that captain and a well-decorated, very prestigious captain in Starfleet, and everybody knew Captain Kirk. And now he's just Admiral Kirk who goes on these training missions or oversees things, and that's really not what he was looking for in his life. And he feels that age. And there's this wonderful scene where he first reunites with Dr. Carol Marcus, BB Besh, and it's in the Genesis tunnel. Should I explain the Genesis device? Yeah, it creates life on barren planets, but they did different tests of it. One of them was they used it underground, and they create this beautiful cave of life that wasn't there. So at any rate, Kirk and McCoy and Savick, they beam down there, and David, Kirk's son, he kind of attacks him, and they have this fist fight before Carol stops him, and then Kirk realizes that's his son, that he was basically told by her to leave alone because she didn't want him to follow in his footsteps. And he did what she asked. He tells her, "I stayed away." And they have just sort of this quiet moment together, and she just asks him how he feels at this moment, and he's just sitting down and he's slumped over. He's not the Captain Kirk you're used to with the swagger and the cockiness. He's just a middle-aged man who is regretting the fact that he just met his son. He even says it, that's the life I should have had, the life I could have had, instead of what he has now. And she asks him, "Well, how do you feel?" And he says, "I feel old and I feel worn out." And it's such a great performance because I know everybody says Shatner overacts, but he is so subtle in this movie, and he can pull off those moments where he is, well, at one point he's actually defeated, but at points where he feels his age and where he feels like everything is passing by him and all these things that he could have had when he was young, and instead he chose to follow this life as a Starfleet captain. That's all gone now, and he can't get that back, and those years aren't coming back. And the way he portrays that is perfect. I think he does an amazing job here, but he still has his Captain Kirk swagger. Every time he walks onto the, any part of the ship, he's always got his, chest puffed out, and he's walking like he owns the shit. And that's always the stuff that you love with Captain Kirk. And his dealings with Khan, of course, Ricardo Montalban, who is just chewing up the scenery as this villain, one of the best villains in the history of movies. They have such a great back and forth. And a really cool part is that they don't share any scenes together physically. Most of their interaction is either through the screens or on a communication device. So the actors never really work together, but you can't tell. You feel this dynamic that they're really in this situation together. And Khan, he kind of gets the upper hand, but Kirk finds ways out of it. And he uses this little trick, and I know this is going to lead to something that everybody laughs about, but where Kirk does like this bad acting. He's bad at bluffing kind of thing, but he's purposely being bad at bluffing. Like when Khan first asks him to send over the information on the Genesis device, Kirk's like, "Genesis? What are you talking about?" And it's really obvious that he knows what it is, but he's just trying to stall Khan so they can get time to get the power up. And also the infamous where he yells out, Kahn, after Kahn traps him in the tunnel. Well, that's basically him overacting so that Kahn really buys the fact that they're trapped in the Genesis tunnel when Kirk knows that Spock's working on the Enterprise and they're going to get everything back together. So he still has that Kirkism to him. And at the final battle, he's Captain Kirk in all his glory. So really the pair of them, Kirk and Kahn, they just carry this movie so well. Every scene they're in is just electric. You're just on the edge of your seat for every piece of dialogue. It all moves everything forward perfectly. With the rest of the cast, this is something that Harve Bennett did well and was smart to do. As opposed to the first film, we get that camaraderie between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. You get it very early on in the scene with the training simulator that blows up. They have some quips with each other that are a lot of fun and remind you of what the show was. Unlike Star Trek The Motion Picture, which kind of drug that out to the end, this one establishes that rapport with each other and that fun. And it makes you feel like, okay, I'm back in the Star Trek universe here. I'm not going to be bored out of my mind with this one. I'm going to have fun. They're having fun. In fact, Leonard Nimoy, I don't know if I mentioned this with the other one, but he did not want to come back as Mr. Spock. He had a feud with Paramount over them using his likeness and not paying him for it, basically. So he was done. They had to offer him a lot of money to come back and be Spock in the first one. And this one, he wanted this to be the last one. Hence, you get Spock's death scene. But he had such a good time working with the cast and the crew that's why they added in the scene where he puts his hand on Bones' face and goes, remember. Because he did kind of want to set it up that he could come back because he enjoyed it so much. So you could tell in this movie that spark is back. And it really makes up for the things that didn't work well in the first one. They work perfectly in this movie. It just feels like they step back into these old clothes perfectly and they know exactly what to do. I also like Kirstie Alley. She does a great job here as Lieutenant Savick. She was a big Star Trek fan as a kid and was dying to be part of this movie. They had actually wanted Kim Cattrall to play Lieutenant Savick in this film, but she couldn't because of scheduling conflicts. But Kim Cattrall does make an appearance in Star Trek VI that we will get to soon enough. Here, Kirstie Alley plays a Vulcan that's kind of part Vulcan, part Romulan. So that's why she has emotional outbursts from time to time. But she is an ambitious cadet. She wants command. She knows the rule book cover to cover and isn't afraid to tell the Admiral Kirk, this legend, that he's not following the rules. And it actually costs Kirk. And he understands his arrogance in that moment and tells her to keep quoting regulations. But she is a career-driven woman, and you can tell. And that's another little piece of trivia. The studio did want Nicholas Meyer to sex her up a little bit, if you know what I'm saying. But he wouldn't have anything to do with it. He said that she was an officer in this organization and that she was striving for this career as an officer. And she wasn't some piece of decoration on the screen. She's actually an integral part of the team, and her intelligence and her knowledge of the rules and the regulations are important to the film. And she's also learning from Kirk and Spock about how to be a better officer in Starfleet, which I just want to throw that in there because I know a lot of people think that before 2016, we didn't have strong female characters, and yet here we have one, and the director fought to have her be a strong female character. I told you there were going to be a lot of positives in this movie because this is, like I said, it's one of my favorite movies. I am going to rank them all at the end of this series. I bet you could probably guess where this one's going to be at, but I absolutely adore this movie. It is like my comfort movie. I watch it probably 2 or 3 times a year, especially now that I've hit an age where I can relate to Kirk, and there's just so many emotional moments in it. And that's, again, another thing they do great in this movie. This movie is under 2 hours long, but they handle so many great themes about aging and friendship and dealing with life and death and finding your place in the world and having to deal with your mistakes from the past, which Kirk has to do with not only Khan, but I shouldn't say a mistake, but his mistake of leaving David and Carol Marcus. That's the mistake he made, really. And it's done to perfection in less than 2 hours. And that's incredible. And then, of course, there's the amazing scene at the end with Spock's death. Oh, my God. I get teary-eyed every time between that And the moment with Kirk and his son David. Oh, God. I think I'll start with the death scene. All right. We'll start there. But it's again, the fact that they've set these characters back up to what they were in the show, and that friendship that they have, when it does hit at the end and Spock is in that chamber and he's sealed off from Kirk and he's basically had all that radiation from the warp chamber all over him and he's basically died. He's blind. It's kind of cool, though, when he stands up and he kind of fixes his uniform as he's about to approach his senior officer. I thought that was a cool touch. Spock would do something like that. Or where he kind of walks into the glass in the room because he's obviously blind, but it's just a little subtle thing. But it's an amazing scene because of how it's acted. Again, as I mentioned, Shatner gets criticized for his overacting, but here it's perfect. You have Spock die in a way that Spock would. He has this very dignified manner about him. He's more worried about the ship escaping and surviving than his own life because, as we all know, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And then, Kirk's just devastated because he wants to be in there with his friend and he can't be, and he's at the other side of the glass, and Spock, he takes off that glove and he puts his hand on the glass and Kirk matches it and he tells him, "You have been and always shall be my friend. Live long and prosper." And that's it. And Kirk, he doesn't bang on the glass and scream and holler and throw his big fit. He just lets out like this weak whimpering no, and he sits down and he's so defeated at that moment in this movie. And Shatner does such an amazing job of pulling that off that you feel that death. It really resonates with you. And then you get into the scene where they launch Spock's body out in the torpedo, and Kirk gives that speech that I'm probably going to get emotional on the next few minutes because he gives that speech. And again, he's Admiral Kirk, so he has to portray himself in a manner in front of his crew where he's not above it all, but where he can control himself. And he's giving that speech, and when he goes, "Of all the souls I've encountered, his was the most human." And he breaks right there, like right in the middle of it. He has that break in his voice. And it's just, if that doesn't move you, then you have no soul. You're going straight to hell. Because it's perfect. It's perfection the way it's handled. And then that leads into the next scene that is just as emotional for me, is when David comes to Kirk's quarters. And they've had sort of this animosity between each other. But David tells him, "Hey, I understand now. After watching you on the bridge, I get it." And he tells him, he says, "I'm proud to be your son." And Kirk, he just stands up and hugs him. And it's just beautiful. It's just beautiful. So all that in a movie about Captain Kirk fighting Khan in this space battle. It's an incredible movie. What else could I say that's positive about this movie? I know I need to end it already with the positive stuff, but the music, they handed this one off. They couldn't really afford Jerry Goldsmith again, so they found this new and upcoming composer named James Horner, who all you movie fans are probably quite familiar with. But at the time, he was a bit unknown. He had just done Battle Beyond the Stars before this, and if you go watch that movie, you could definitely tell it was him doing that movie. But he has gone on. I would recommend going and looking up all of the movies that he was a composer for. He sadly passed away, I believe, from cancer back in 2015. But he did, oh my God, he did the music for Aliens and Commando and The Rocketeer. And, oh my God, I could just go on and on with all the movies that he has done. A Beautiful Mind, American Beauty, The Mask of Zorro. Like I said, I could go on and on. I would recommend looking him up on IMDb and just seeing all the movies that that you think, oh my God, I know that movie. He's pretty much done most of the music for those. Does a great job here. It is, dare I say, perfect again for the 1 millionth time on this episode, but it knows when to ramp up that orchestra and get you on the edge of your seat as action is about to start, and it also knows when to slow things down and repeat themes from the original movie, as well as character themes, and just start to finish. It's, again, one of my favorite soundtracks. I actually listen to the soundtrack from time to time as well. I told you, I absolutely love this fucking movie. And I could probably go on and on for days and days and days. It could be the longest podcast in the history of podcasts, but I'm not going to. Let's go ahead and move on to the bad. And this is a big challenge because, as I mentioned, I think this movie is damn near perfect. I really struggle. I think one of them's more just a nitpick than anything. I will say, while they get a little more to do in this movie, Uhura, Sulu, Scotty, they sort of fade into the background at times. Chekhov, he has a lot to do very early on in the movie, but once he boards the Enterprise, he just kind of disappears again. So, as I mentioned, they have more to do here and have a little more dialogue and interaction, and you can see them in more scenes than in the first one. They still, again, are more in the background than they probably could have been. That will get remedied in the next couple of movies, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But here, I mean, like I said, I'm struggling to find something negative here. I mean, on the show, they weren't really central to anything either. But like I said, I got to be fair and find something negative. My last negative, and again, this one feels so much like a nitpick, and I might get the planets wrong. I always get them confused. But very early on, when Chekhov and Captain Terrell are finding these planets, and they think they're going to Ceti Alpha 5, that's where they think they're going. Whereas Khan was left by Kirk on Ceti Alpha 6, which was a flourishing planet, and Ceti Alpha 5 was just a rocket space. They never really have anything like, you would think in the 23rd century at this point, there would be some sort of alert that they're in that system, saying, oh, by the way, this is where Khan was left back in however many years ago. Or there would be something, or like Chekhov recognizes Khan when he meets him for the first time. He's like, oh, you. So you would think when he heard Ceti Alpha 5, he'd be like, I remember something about Ceti Alpha 6, if I'm not mistaken. So, like I said, that's a little bit of a nitpick, but it's just something that when I watched the movie, I'm like, come on, something would have alerted them on that. But however, I think in my reading of the trivia section and whatnot, there was something that was either, I don't know if it was a deleted scene or they took it out of the script, but there was a moment where Chekhov does acknowledge something about Ceti Alpha 5 and 6, about their orbits are different. So they really aren't that close to each other. That's why they didn't think it was Ceti Alpha 6. But they cut that out of the movie for some reason. I don't know. But at any rate, they could have explained that a little bit better. That would have probably helped out. And like I said, I struggled to find anything negative in this movie. So let's move to the nitpicky. And again, these are things that are neither good nor bad, just little things I see in these movies that make me laugh. The first one, and this hits early in the movie, there's a moment where Kirk and Spock meet outside of the simulator. They're in a hallway there. Every time I watch the movie, these two things stand out to me. One of them is they have an exit sign over the door that is exactly like the exit sign you would see over any door. If you went to the grocery store or whatever, the movie theater, there'd be an exit sign. It looks exactly like that. And it always stands out to me because I'm like, this is the 23rd century. It should be like a hologram or something a little more sci-fi than just the standard sign we use nowadays. And there's also another sign that looks like one of those ones you see out in front of like a hotel convention room or something, telling you what's going on in there. It's just a sign on a stand. And every time they show that scene, I always think somebody should have spoke up and been like, hey, let's make this a little more sci-fi than just somebody grab a sign from the corner over there and put it right here. We need something in the way. Let's see, my next nitpick, and this is another thing I've noticed over the years of watching this movie that makes me laugh. I mentioned that very emotional scene between Carol Marcus and Admiral Kirk where they're in the Genesis tunnel. Well, right before the scene, everybody leaves the area except Chekhov because he had that nasty little space worm in his ear. It's so gross. I don't even want to talk about it. It makes me cringe every time. But at any rate, right before everybody leaves, McCoy says, oh, he's coming to. He's getting better now. So throughout the scene where it's just Carol Marcus and Kirk, there's only one other person in there, and it's Chekhov. And he's sitting over there in the corner. Well, actually, he's laying in the corner, but he's conscious. And they're having this deep, meaningful conversation. And I always feel bad for Chekhov. You feel like at some point he'd be like, oh, do you all want me to leave the room right now? I'm sorry, Admiral Kirk, that you're feeling down about your age right now, but I feel like I shouldn't be a part of this. Oh, that's your son? I didn't know you had a son. It always just feels so awkward at that moment whenever I see him in the background. Fortunately, the performances are so good, I don't really pay that much attention to him, but it does make me laugh. And my final nitpick, all right, this isn't really a nitpick. This is just me having fun. But this movie is about Admiral Kirk fighting Han over Genesis. And as Genesis is my favorite band, I like to think that Kahn would probably be a Peter Gabriel era Genesis fan, where he would just be like, everything that happened after 1975 when Peter Gabriel left the band is terrible and I hate it. That's why he's so angry. Whereas Kirk is a smarter, older, more sophisticated man. He appreciates all eras of Genesis, and he can appreciate the musical talent of Phil Collins and the growth of the band into what it became through the history of rock and roll music. Now, Spock, he's just learned about Genesis in this movie, but I also like to think, since he is a logical creature, that he would appreciate all eras of Genesis as well, that he could see beyond the hate from the Peter Gabriel era fans and embrace the greatness of Genesis. And Dr. McCoy, well, he's got no taste. He doesn't know anything. I mean, this is a guy that sits around a campfire singing row, row, row your boat. So we're not really going to pay attention to him. So I have to side with my beloved Starfleet officers and their love for Genesis. And I know that was so lame, but I do love Genesis and I love this movie. And every time they would go, "Where is Genesis?" And I'm like, well, here, do you want some of my CDs, or do you want me to just download the music for you? What's up? And you're not getting that on any other Star Trek II review or retrospective. As a matter of fact, none of them other hosts are talking about a band that probably most of you have never even listened to. But that's what I'm doing here. I'm entertaining myself talking about one of my favorite movies. So I am going to inject my favorite band, because they kept saying Genesis through the whole movie. And every time I get done with the movie, I want to listen to a Genesis album. So overall, if you couldn't tell, I absolutely love this movie. As I mentioned, it's one of my all-time favorite movies. I cannot recommend it enough. If you haven't watched it in a while, go back and watch it again and enjoy just the magnificence on screen. Appreciate the filmmaking and the acting and how well they can tell that story in less than 2 hours and keep you invested all the way through. If you are someone who loves Star Trek, and you probably love this movie as well, and you meet someone and they're like, "Hey, I want to watch these movies. Which one should I watch first?" While I probably wouldn't say this one, it's tough. There's another movie that is universally known as the most audience-friendly Star Trek movie that we'll get to soon. But I would say that you could recommend this to a non-Star Trek fan, and they would enjoy it. As I mentioned, it's so well made and so well paced and so easy to watch. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Like I said, you have to engage with the movie, but the movie, it welcomes you in and it says, come along for the ride. And I think the humor and the chemistry with the actors, as well as the story and the pacing, that even a non-Star Trek fan could watch this movie and enjoy it. You might not get all the little bits here and there, but I think it tells enough of the story that you can follow along with it and not have to know the whole background. You get where the characters are, who they are, what their positions and everything is, and you understand the battles and where the ships are and what's going on with all that chaos. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, I can't recommend this enough. If you've never watched a Star Trek movie, definitely watch this movie. You're going to love it. And as I mentioned, it's the one that saves the franchise, because if this had failed, we probably would have never got another Star Trek movie. And it's also the one that the other entries into the franchise, the Next Generation and the J.J. Abrams version, tried so desperately to manufacture this movie again, and they could not do it, because this is a perfect movie and you cannot improve on perfection. So that wraps up my Star Trek II, The Wrath of Kahn review. Hopefully I didn't fanboy out too much. I promise from here on out I'll be a little more restrained, a little bit more. And to be honest, Star Trek 3, 4, 5, and 6, I don't watch on a regular basis. I can't remember the last time I watched Star Trek 3, so it's going to be fun to talk about that. It obviously will be the next movie in this series, Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. But I also have my other movie reviews that I do that you can listen to as well if you enjoyed this. I do a new release movie over the weekend, and then I tend to do a streaming movie towards the end of the week. So you get a lot of content from me because I love talking about these movies. And I especially love talking about great movies like this. So before I go, I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to my podcast. I tell everyone I've got the smartest and sexiest audience in all the podcast universe. And you never fail to live up to those high standards. And as you are traveling around on this blue and green ball bouncing through the cosmos, I need you to do two things for me. First, I need you to remember that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And second, as always, live long and prosper.